history, every state's water project came up for funding. No senator voted against any other senator's water project because this was a critical issue. Many of the projects were completely unnecessary, but it came about because of if you don't use it, you lose it.
Reminds me of sitting on property.
Oh, exactly.
It's like squatting, basically.
Yep, exactly. Now, the example I was going to give was the Colorado River, of course, and the claims on that river. It's a whole program in itself because you've taken so much water out of the river now that hardly any of it gets to the ocean. And what water does cross into Mexico has to be desalinated in order to be of sufficient quality for the Mexicans to use it. But there was claims to water rights along the Colorado. I talked earlier about the Hopi and the Navajo and so on. A group of those people got together, went to the Supreme Court with aerial photographs and said, look, here we've got irrigation systems that we built 1,000 years ago using water from the Colorado, so we've got prior rights claims. Well, boy, did that create a confusion. And so, of course, this is the difficulty with this prior rights. How do you establish it? And then how do you accommodate people that don't have access to water? When the U.S. changed to the prior rights or appropriative doctrine, around 1900, the turn of the century, and of course you think about California with the Imperial Dam and all those projects there, the irrigation and so on, there was the International Joint Commission, which was a treaty between Canada and the U.S. about cross-boundary issues. They applied Canadian law to the water. Whenever there's a dispute nowadays about water, Canadian law is applied. But Canadian law is completely different. It's riparian law, not appropriative doctrine. And so whenever there's been a ruling on it, as there was with the project in North Dakota and into Manitoba, then they applied Canadian law, and all the Americans screamed and said, oh, you sold us out. The Americans on the panel sold us out. And so what you got are two countries, because the Americans changed to appropriative doctrine, Canadians didn't. We stuck with the riparian doctrine. So you've got a trade agreement between two countries over a resource on which their fundamental laws are philosophically completely different. And I don't know where that's going to end up in the future, what that does. And I can tell you how touchy an issue this is, that a Manitoba Minister of Natural Resources by the name of Al Mackling, at a public debate about water and the Red River and flows across the border, and somebody said, well, you know, the Americans don't want our water, and Mackling said, if they want it, they'll just get their guns and come and get it. He had to resign the next day. And so you can see the problems. It goes back to what I said at the beginning about trade agreements. On the basis of simple trade, it all sounds very nice and easy, but the ramifications of it from a cultural, social, political,
economic,
philosophical basis are huge.
I want to thank you for taking your time to be with us today. There's so much more to talk about, and I want to invite you back. I'm sure you have way more to say about this.
I do, and particularly to look at it on an international basis. I touched on Israel briefly. And, of course, Israel is also in the forefront of so many of these issues because of its strategic problems. And, by the way, they're one of the world's biggest producers of drip irrigation systems, which is an outgrowth of that. But also to look at what's going on the Nile River as Sudan and those countries start to take their share of the Nile River. In Iraq, the problems on the Tigris and Euphrates, which, of course, is where the Fertile Crescent and agriculture began. So there's so many issues around the world that we could look at and talk about and help people understand the world and understand that, yeah, there's resources and trade helps humanity and gives us a better life, but you better understand the
devil's in the details. The devil's always in the details.
Always in the details, yes.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, we have been talking with, learning from, and listening to Dr. Tim Ball. You can reach him by going to drtimball.com, drtimball.com. And thank you so much for being with us today and really explaining the fullness of what we have to consider when it comes to water resources, water itself, geography, different type of legal agreements, NAFTA, and trade itself. Thanks again, Tim.
Thank you very much for the opportunity, Kim.